Ladies and gentlemen, Sonny Hostin has a hot take on the Black Lives Matter riots.
I just think we need to make it clear that there can be no comparison between the Black Lives Matter movement and what we saw on January 6th. I just want to make that clear. There were very limited destruction of property and violence during the uprising.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and of course that was the co-host of The View issuing forth with her opinion that the Black Lives Matter riots were a very peaceful uprising. Now, these two things don't really go together. Uprisings generally aren't very peaceful, and I want to analyze both ends of that equation. But first, just say this is an issue worth dwelling on because the cult of George Floyd is still very much with us. Here was Governor Tim Walz visiting George Floyd Square on Memorial Day. Like everything that doofus does, painful, cringeworthy, embarrassing. Here was his ex-post. 6 years ago today, George Floyd's murder started a global movement for change. Let us continue working to build a society that lives up to its democratic ideals of liberty and justice for all. Of course, Mayor Fry had to declare himself as well. Today we remember George Floyd, who was murdered by a former Minneapolis police officer 6 years ago. That moment changed our city forever. I hate to say it, Fry is actually right. The death of George Floyd did change Minneapolis, just not for the better. And Walz is right, it created a global movement for change, just not change in the right direction. It led to the entrenching and intensification of all sorts of DEI practices and institutions across American life, and to the depolicing of many major cities in America, leading to an increase in crime, a spike in crime that disproportionately hurt minority, vulnerable communities. Now, what about the notion, going back to Hostin, that the riots were an uprising? I actually think that's a correct word. An uprising just means a revolt against established authority. Now, the left, when it uses this word, at least in the domestic context, it means it in a positive way. It means a revolt against an illegitimate authority, which is our system of justice, which they believe is inherently racist. And this is completely wrong. This is a lie. Let's go to some of the data. Here's a report from the Manhattan Institute a couple years ago by my friend Robert Verbruggen. He points out that there are about 1,000 fatal police shootings a year. And when you break it down by race, you get about a quarter of those killed by cops are African Americans. Now that's about double the Black share of the population, but accords with important other data points from the criminal justice system. About a quarter of arrests are of African Americans, a quarter of murders, about a quarter of violent crime offenders as reported by victims. So that's the basic picture when it comes to all these questions about racism in our criminal justice system. Police activity roughly in keeping with disproportionate rates of Black offending. But people's beliefs about this are so out of whack. Here's a crazy piece of data from a survey not too long ago. Now, this survey asked people how many unarmed Black men were killed. This was back in 2019, and broke it down by ideology. And here, if you look at the very liberal quadrant, nearly 8% thought that more than 10,000 unarmed Black men were killed by cops. Then you had about 14% who thought 10,000 or so were killed. Then you get 31% think it was about 1,000. Then you get another 30% think it was about 100. The liberal respondents basically in the same place. And the actual number? 12. 12 unarmed Black men shot by police fatally in 2019. This is one of these lies, by the way, that I don't understand. It's a lie about our own society. Traditionally, throughout human history, people have lied about other countries, other peoples, other societies, but here we are perpetrating a lie about ourselves, and so many people believing it. Relatedly, by the way, here's another totally out of whack belief. This one was highlighted by the great Wilford Riley. 60% of very liberal people think that George Floyd was a model citizen. And of course, if you know anything, even the slightest little bit about George Floyd, you know that's not true. But in various forms, either slightly agree, or strongly agree, very liberals, a majority of very liberals, think that Floyd was a model citizen. Now, those people are obviously operating in an information bubble, in a really small one. Maybe we should have some sympathy for Sunny Hostin, by the way, because she's clearly inside that bubble herself, but she's also perpetrating the bubble. That brings us back to the notion that the riots were peaceful. No, they weren't peaceful. They were riots. Just look at Minneapolis alone. Something like 1,300 buildings were damaged along a 5-mile stretch of Lake Street there in Minneapolis. About 1,000 buildings damaged, 140 or so rendered uninhabitable, 53 destroyed entirely, and the overall insurance cost estimated to be $500 million or so, which would make Minneapolis, by some estimates, the second most costly riot in U.S. history. Look at this table from an outfit called Minnesota Reformer. You got down on the bottom here these 1967 and 68 riots that were incredibly destructive. Insurance cost in 2020 dollars, 105, 116, 119. Detroit in 67, 326 million. Then unfortunately you had the granddaddy of them all and the LA riots after the acquittal of the cops in the beating of Rodney King. That was 1.4 billion. But then you have Minnesota here, 500 million. Number two. At the same time, you had other disturbances in cities across America, New York City, Atlanta, LA, Chicago, on and on. Estimated overall cost of all of this, something like $2 billion. People died. It was terrible. So it wasn't peaceful by any means, the so-called uprising. But I think an implicit argument in what Hostin is saying, although she doesn't say it explicitly, others did at the time, is that, well, look, this is just property destruction, and destroying people's property somehow isn't violence. Here was Nicole Hannah-Jones of 1619 Project fame. Violence is when an agent of the state kneels on a man's neck until all the life is leached out of his body. Destroying property, which can be replaced, is not violence. To use the same language to describe those two things is not moral. David Remnick in The New Yorker had a piece called An American Uprising. He quoted a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network who said, "We don't have time to finger wag at protesters about property. That can be rebuilt. Target will reopen." An article in the lefty journal Current Affairs said that applying the word violence to destruction of property risks, quote, making the term conceptually incoherent and, much more important, conflating acts that do very serious physical harm to people with acts that have not physically harmed anyone. But of course, destroying property is an act of violence. If we go back to ancient Rome, the Romans didn't just commit violence in Carthage, say, when they killed a bunch of people. They committed violence when they razed the city to the ground. And this distinction that progressives want to make between violence against persons and violence against property isn't so easy to maintain, because you might just think, well, I'm burning down this store or ransacking this store, but there might be someone very committed to protecting that store. There might be someone in the house you are burning down. And property destruction has real effect on people's lives. Minneapolis didn't recover from this property destruction for years. I mentioned briefly the riots in 67 and 68 in major U.S. cities. Places like Washington, D.C. and Detroit didn't recover for decades from that spasm of destruction of property. And by the way, Target was mentioned as an example of something that can just take this because it's a big corporation. But if you burn your local Target to the ground, it's very likely Target is going to say, you know what, we're not just going to rebuild in the same way in the same spot. We're moving out of there. So that was a business that was employing local minorities, and minorities who live in the neighborhood were shopping there. You are hurting all of them. Then there's small business owners who have poured so much of themselves and their labor and their blood, sweat, and tears into building something that you are wantonly destroying when they haven't done anything wrong. That is a direct harm against them. And lefties will sometimes say, wow, it's not a big deal because insurance will cover it. But a lot of small businesses aren't insured. So in short, the Black Lives Matter riots were a violent uprising in the cause of a deeply unjust ideology, even if word has not yet reached the set and probably never will of The View. Hey, by the way, comment, like, subscribe. I guarantee you won't regret it. I'm Rich Lowry. Over and out.